Dawn breaks over the Coral Sea on May 7, 1942. Somewhere in the vast expanse of water between Australia and New Guinea, two massive naval forces hunt each other across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. The ships never see each other. The admirals command battles they cannot witness. Sailors die without ever glimpsing the enemy. This is carrier warfare, a revolution in naval combat where the decisive weapons are not guns but aircraft, where battles are fought not at visual range but over horizons, and where the outcome depends not on armor and firepower but on reconnaissance, timing, and the courage of pilots flying into hostile skies. The Japanese objective is ambitious: seize Port Moresby on New Guinea's southern coast, establishing a base that threatens Australia and secures Japan's southern defensive perimeter. The invasion force, designated Operation MO, includes 11 transports carrying 5,000 troops, protected by cruisers, destroyers, and most critically, two fleet carriers, Shikaku and Zuikaku, veteran ships that participated in the Pearl Harbor attack just 5 months earlier. If successful, Japan will control the Coral Sea, isolate Australia, and potentially force the Allies to negotiate peace from a position of weakness. Standing in their way are two American carrier task forces. Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, centers on USS Yorktown. Task Force 11, under Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, is built around USS Lexington. These carriers represent America's most valuable naval assets in the Pacific. Their loss would be catastrophic, but failure to stop the Port Moresby invasion would be equally disastrous. The stakes could not be higher. What unfolds over the next 4 days will be unlike anything in naval history. For the first time, carrier task forces will engage in combat without the opposing ships ever sighting each other. Aircraft will be the weapons. Pilots will be the cutting edge. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and timing will matter more than traditional naval tactics. The Battle of the Coral Sea will establish patterns that define Pacific naval warfare for the remainder of the war. It will demonstrate both the enormous potential and terrible vulnerability of aircraft carriers, and it will produce a tactical Japanese victory that becomes a strategic American triumph, a battle lost that changes the course of the war. This is the story of the Battle of the Coral Sea, where naval warfare entered a new age, where brave men flew obsolete aircraft into overwhelming odds, and where a battle fought to a draw stopped Japanese expansion and set the stage for Midway. By May 1942, Japan's conquests had exceeded even optimistic pre-war projections. The Philippines were occupied, the Dutch East Indies captured, Singapore fallen, Burma conquered. The defensive perimeter stretched from Burma through the East Indies to New Guinea and the Central Pacific, but Japanese strategic planning called for further expansion to secure this perimeter against Allied counterattack. Port Moresby, on New Guinea's southern coast, was the key. This Allied base, directly across from Australia, posed a threat to Japanese positions in New Guinea and Rabaul. More critically, it provided a potential launching point for Allied offensives northward. Japanese planners believed capturing Port Moresby would eliminate this threat, provide a base for air operations against northern Australia, and secure the southern flank of Japan's defensive perimeter. Operation MO, the Port Moresby invasion, was scheduled for early May. The plan was complex, involving multiple task forces converging on the Coral Sea. Rear Admiral Aritomo Godo commanded the invasion force, 11 transports with escorts. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi commanded the carrier striking force, fleet carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku with supporting cruisers and destroyers. Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka led a separate invasion force targeting Chilagi and the Solomon Islands. Additional cruisers and the light carrier Shoho provided cover for various elements. The Japanese plan assumed Allied forces would react slowly, allowing the invasion to proceed before substantial opposition materialized. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American intelligence, specifically the code-breaking unit at Pearl Harbor, had partially broken Japanese naval codes. While not providing complete intelligence, the intercepts gave enough information to alert Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, that a major Japanese operation targeting Port Moresby was imminent. Nimitz responded by concentrating available carrier forces. Task Force 17, centered on Yorktown, was already operating in the Coral Sea. Task Force 11, built around Lexington, was ordered south from Pearl Harbor. The two task forces would combine under Fletcher's command, creating a force of 2 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. It was fewer ships than the Japanese had committed, but American intelligence advantage gave Fletcher the opportunity to position his forces for maximum effect. The strategic calculus favored neither side overwhelmingly. Japanese carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku were slightly superior to their American counterparts in aircraft capacity and veteran aircrew experience. However, American ships carried radar, providing crucial advantage in reconnaissance and fighter direction. Japanese forces had numerical superiority in escorts. American forces had better intelligence. The battle would be decided by execution, luck, and the courage of men flying into combat. The battle's opening moves occurred on May 3 when Japanese forces occupied Chalagi in the Solomon Islands unopposed. The small Australian garrison had withdrawn, leaving the excellent harbor for Japanese use. Admiral Fletcher, receiving reports of the occupation, detached from his refueling operations and raced north to strike Chalagi with Yorktown's aircraft. On May 4, Yorktown launched 3 separate strikes against Japanese shipping at Chalagi. American pilots claimed significant success. Destroyer, several minesweepers, and various smaller vessels sunk or damaged. Post-war analysis revealed more modest results. 1 destroyer and 3 minesweepers sunk, several other ships damaged. But the strike demonstrated American willingness to engage and worried Japanese commanders about Allied strength in the area. The Chalagi strike also revealed problems that would plague both sides throughout the battle. Pilots, seeing ships through smoke and anti-aircraft fire, dramatically overestimated damage inflicted. This pattern, honest but mistaken damage assessment, would create confusion for commanders trying to evaluate battle results. Both sides would claim victories that post-war analysis showed were exaggerated. In the fog of war, with ships hundreds of miles apart and pilots the only source of information, accurate assessment was nearly impossible. May 5 and 6 saw both sides searching for each other while maneuvering for advantage. Fletcher's Task Force 17 and Fitch's Task Force 11 met on May 5, combining into a single force under Fletcher's command. The combined American force now operated as a unit, enhancing defensive capability, but also creating a larger target if discovered. Japanese forces were scattered across the Coral Sea. The carrier striking force under Takagi operated independently, searching for American carriers. The invasion force, with escort carrier Shoho providing air cover, proceeded toward Port Moresby. Supporting cruiser forces patrolled between these formations. This dispersal, doctrinally sound in Japanese naval thinking, meant Japanese forces could not mutually support if attacked. Both sides launched extensive reconnaissance missions. American PBY Catalina flying boats, operating from Australian bases, provided long-range search capability that partially compensated for American numerical inferiority. Japanese float planes, launched from cruisers and battleships, conducted their own searches. But the vast ocean made finding enemy carriers like finding needles in a haystack. Weather added complications. Squalls and clouds provided concealment, but also hindered reconnaissance. By May 6, both sides knew enemy carriers were in the Coral Sea, but neither had located the other. The tension was extraordinary. Sailors and aircrews understood that whoever found the enemy first would gain potentially decisive advantage. The race for contact became the battle's critical phase. May 7, 1942, saw both sides locate and attack targets, but not the targets they sought. The day became a masterclass in how confusion, mistaken identification, and communication failures characterize real combat. At dawn, both sides launched reconnaissance aircraft. A Japanese scout plane from carrier Shikoku reported sighting an American carrier and cruiser approximately 175 miles south of the Japanese carrier force. This report was partially correct. The planes had spotted the oiler USS Neosho and destroyer USS Sims, detached from Fletcher's main force. But in the early morning light, filtering through clouds, the pilot mistook these ships for a carrier task force. Believing they had found Fletcher's carriers, Japanese commanders launched a full strike, 78 aircraft from Shikoku and Zuikaku. The strike force located Neosho and Sims around 9:30 hours and attacked with overwhelming force. Sims was sunk quickly. Neosho, a larger and more robust ship, absorbed multiple bomb hits but remained afloat, drifting as a burning hulk. The Japanese strike leader, realizing the error, radioed back that they had attacked the wrong targets. But the strike was expended. Aircraft had dropped their ordnance and consumed fuel. The Japanese carrier's striking power was temporarily neutralized. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance had located Japanese ships. A scout plane from Yorktown reported 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers at a position approximately 225 miles northwest. This report was also partially incorrect. The pilot had misidentified 2 cruisers as carriers. But Fletcher, believing he had found the main Japanese carrier force, launched a full strike from both carriers, 93 aircraft. The American strike force, led by Lieutenant Commander William Alt, searched the reported location but found nothing. Expanding their search, they eventually located not the main Japanese carriers but the invasion force, including light carrier Shoho. This was not the primary target, but it was a significant one. At approximately 1100 hours, American dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked Shoho. The attack was devastatingly effective. Lacking the defensive capability of fleet carriers, Shoho absorbed 13 bomb hits and 7 torpedo hits in just minutes. The carrier, overwhelmed by explosions and fires, capsized and sank at 11:35 hours, taking 638 men with her. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading scout bombers from Lexington, radioed the immortal message, "Scratch one flat top." It was the first Japanese carrier sunk in the war, a significant psychological and tactical victory. But the main Japanese carriers remained unlocated and undamaged. Fletcher now faced a dilemma. His strike aircraft were returning, low on fuel needing recovery. Japanese carriers were somewhere in the Coral Sea, potentially preparing their own strike. Should he launch another strike immediately or recover aircraft first? Fletcher chose recovery, prioritizing preservation of his aircrews and accepting the risk that Japanese carriers might strike before he could launch again. The Japanese faced similar decisions. Having expended their morning strike against wrong targets, they knew American carriers were close. In late afternoon, Takagi launched a strike of 27 aircraft to attack the American carriers, estimated to be about 280 miles away. But darkness was approaching. The strike, launched too late, failed to locate American ships in deteriorating visibility. Worse, returning to their carriers in darkness, many Japanese pilots became lost. American radar detected them circling, trying to find their ships. Some Japanese aircraft, seeing Yorktown's lights, attempted to land on the American carrier before recognizing their error and fleeing. Of the 27 aircraft launched, only 18 returned. 9 were lost, 6 ditched at sea running out of fuel, 3 shot down by American fighters during confused engagements in darkness. The losses hurt, but the real damage was to aircrew experience. Japan's naval aviation depended on highly trained veteran pilots. Each loss was difficult to replace. May 7th ended with both sides having attacked secondary targets while the main forces remained intact. Shoho was sunk, a victory for America, but the Japanese invasion force, delayed by the carrier's loss, remained a threat. Most critically, The two main carrier forces had not yet engaged. Both sides knew the decisive battle would come on May 8th. Dawn on May 8th found both carrier forces approximately 200 miles apart, steaming on roughly parallel courses. Both admirals knew that whoever struck first would gain potentially decisive advantage. Both launched reconnaissance aircraft at first light, racing to locate the enemy. At 8:15 hours, American scout planes reported the Japanese carriers. Almost simultaneously, Japanese scouts located the American task force. Both sides now knew the enemy's position. The race was on, who could launch first, and whose strike would prove more effective. Both sides launched within minutes of each other. Fletcher launched 69 aircraft from Yorktown at 900 hours. Fitch launched 53 aircraft from Lexington shortly after. Japanese carriers launched 69 aircraft around the same time. Both strikes, passing each other in the air at different altitudes, proceeded toward their targets. The American strike reached the Japanese carriers around 1100 hours. Shikaku and Zuikaku, operating separately for mutual defense, presented different profiles. Shikaku maneuvered aggressively but remained visible. Zuikaku found a convenient rain squall and disappeared into it, becoming invisible to attacking aircraft. American pilots, facing heavy anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter opposition, concentrated on the visible target. Shikaku absorbed 3 bomb hits from dive bombers, 1 forward, 2 amidships. The explosion started fires and damaged the flight deck, rendering the carrier unable to launch or recover aircraft. But the carrier's hull remained intact, and damage control parties contained the fires. Shikaku's speed was reduced but not eliminated. The carrier, though damaged, survived. Zuikaku, hiding in the rain squall, escaped unscathed. American torpedo attacks were less successful. TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, faced devastating defensive fire. Japanese fighters slaughtered them. Anti-aircraft guns added to the carnage. Of the torpedo bombers launched, few survived to drop torpedoes, and none of those torpedoes hit. The Devastator's inadequacy, apparent at Coral Sea, would be confirmed at Midway with even more horrific losses. The Japanese strike reached the American carriers simultaneously. Lexington and Yorktown, operating close together for mutual support, presented the attackers with 2 large targets. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo bombers coordinated their attacks with professional precision honed through years of training. Yorktown, maneuvering radically under Captain Elliot Buckmaster's skilled ship handling, avoided 8 torpedoes but absorbed 1 bomb hit that penetrated 3 decks before exploding, killing or wounding 66 men. Damage control parties quickly contained the damage. Yorktown remained operational, capable of launching and recovering aircraft. Lexington was less fortunate. The larger carrier, less maneuverable than Yorktown, took 2 torpedo hits on the port side and 3 bomb hits. Initially, damage appeared manageable. Fires were contained. The carrier maintained speed and continued operating aircraft, but torpedo damage had ruptured aviation fuel tanks and cracked fuel lines. Gasoline vapor accumulated in spaces below decks, creating a massive explosive hazard. At 12:47 hours, a tremendous explosion rocked Lexington as accumulated gasoline vapor ignited. The blast knocked out water mains and fire suppression systems. More explosions followed as fires spread to bomb storage spaces. By afternoon, Lexington was clearly doomed. At 17:07 hours, Captain Frederick Sherman ordered abandoned ship. Destroyers rescued most of the crew. 770 men saved from a complement of 2,951. At 19:53 hours, destroyer USS Phelps torpedoed the burning hulk, sending Lady Lex to the bottom. The battle was over. Both sides had struck simultaneously. Both had inflicted damage. Shoho and Lexington were sunk. Shikaku was damaged but survived. Yorktown was lightly damaged but operational. More critically for Japan, both Shikaku and Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and aircrew that neither would be available for the upcoming Midway operation. By May 8 evening, both sides withdrew. Admiral Takagi, having sunk Lexington and damaged Yorktown, could claim tactical victory. The Americans had lost more tonnage. Lexington displaced 33,000 tons versus Shoho's 11,000 tons. American aircraft losses were slightly higher than Japanese. In traditional naval terms, Japan won. But Operation MO, the Port Moresby invasion, was cancelled. Without Shoho providing air cover and with American carriers still operating in the Coral Sea, the invasion convoy was too vulnerable. The transports turned back. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. Strategically, America had won. For the first time, Japanese expansion had been stopped not by defeat in battle, but by the threat of defeat being too great to risk. The casualty figures reflected the battle's intensity. American losses totaled 656 killed, 543 from Lexington, 66 from Yorktown, 35 from Neosho, 12 from Sims. Japanese losses were approximately 1,074 killed, 638 from Shoho, approximately 90 aircrew lost in combat or operational accidents, and approximately 346 from various ships sunk or damaged. More significantly, Japan lost approximately 60 aircraft and their irreplaceable veteran aircrew. The material losses hurt both sides. America lost fleet carrier Lexington, oiler Neosho, and destroyer Sims. Japan lost light carrier Shoho and destroyer Kikuzuki, with fleet carrier Shikaku heavily damaged. But America's industrial capacity meant Lexington could be replaced. Several Essex-class carriers were already under construction. Japan's limited industrial base made replacing fleet carriers far more difficult. The aircraft losses were even more strategically significant. Both Shikaku and Zuikaku, though the latter undamaged, had lost so many aircraft and aircrew that they required months to rebuild their air groups. This meant neither carrier would be available for the Midway operation planned for early June. That absence would prove catastrophic for Japan at Midway, where the presence of 2 additional veteran fleet carriers might have changed the battle's outcome. The Battle of the Coral Sea established patterns that would define carrier warfare throughout the Pacific War. Several lessons emerged from the 4-day battle. First, reconnaissance was paramount. The battle was won or lost in the scouting phase. Whoever located the enemy first gained potentially decisive advantage. Both sides dramatically expanded search operations after Coral Sea, understanding that finding the enemy was often more important than striking power. Second, timing mattered enormously. Launching too early meant aircraft might not find targets. Launching too late meant facing enemy strikes while recovering aircraft. The delicate balance between launching offensively and maintaining defensive readiness became central to carrier operations. Third, carrier vulnerability was stark. Despite their enormous striking power, carriers were fragile. A few well-placed torpedoes or bombs could sink these massive ships or render them inoperable. This vulnerability meant carriers required extensive escort forces and fighter protection, lessons both sides absorbed and applied in subsequent battles. Fourth, coordination between different types of aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters, was essential. At Coral Sea, both sides launched somewhat uncoordinated attacks. Future operations would emphasize timing attacks so different aircraft types arrived simultaneously, overwhelming defenses. Fifth, damage control could be decisive. Yorktown survived bomb damage through effective damage control. Lexington succumbed not to initial damage, but to secondary explosions caused by inadequate vapor control. Both navies improved damage control procedures based on Coral Sea experience. Sixth, accurate damage assessment was nearly impossible in combat. Both sides dramatically overestimated damage inflicted. Pilots, seeing explosions and fires, honestly believed they had achieved more than post-war analysis confirmed. This problem persisted throughout the war, with commanders making decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Behind the statistics and strategic analysis were individual acts of courage that defined the battle. American and Japanese pilots flew obsolete or inadequate aircraft against overwhelming opposition because duty demanded it. Lieutenant Commander John Powers, commanding VB-5 from Yorktown, had promised before the battle to get a hit, even if it meant dying. During the attack on Shoho, Powers dove his SBD Dauntless to impossibly low altitude, releasing his bomb at 200 feet, far below safe release height. His bomb hit Shoho's flight deck. Powers did not pull out of his dive. His aircraft, damaged by the explosion or unable to recover from such a low attack, crashed into the sea. He and his gunner died. Powers received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, whose radio message, "Scratch one flat top," became famous, led VB-2 from Lexington through intense anti-aircraft fire to bomb Shoho. His leadership and skill exemplified the professional excellence of American naval aviators who, despite flying in peacetime until recently, adapted quickly to combat. Japanese pilots demonstrated equal courage. Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi led the strike against Lexington, coordinating torpedo and dive bomber attacks with professional precision. His pilots pressed home attacks despite heavy losses, demonstrating the skill and determination that made Japanese naval aviation formidable throughout 1942. The aircrew losses hurt both sides, but affected Japan more severely. American pilot training programs could replace losses, expanding production of trained aviators throughout the war. Japan's more limited training infrastructure meant each experienced pilot lost was nearly irreplaceable. At Coral Sea, Japan lost approximately 90 aircrew, veterans whose experience was invaluable. Those losses, compounded by similar losses at Midway weeks later, began the erosion of Japanese naval aviation quality that would accelerate throughout the war. The Battle of the Coral Sea's strategic impact exceeded its tactical results. Most immediately, the Port Moresby invasion was cancelled. Japan would later attempt to capture Port Moresby via overland attack across New Guinea's Owen Stanley Mountains, but that attempt would also fail. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands, providing a base for operations that eventually recaptured New Guinea. More significantly, the battle removed Shikoku and Zuikaku from the Midway operation. Shikoku required repairs that would take months. Zuikaku needed to rebuild her air group, a process that also took months. Admiral Yamamoto, planning the Midway operation, had counted on having 6 fleet carriers available. Instead, he had only 4. Those 2 missing carriers might have been decisive at Midway, where American victory hung on narrow margins. The battle boosted American morale. After 5 months of unbroken defeats and retreats, American forces had finally stopped Japanese expansion. The strategic situation remained dire, but Coral Sea demonstrated that Japan was not invincible, that American carriers could fight effectively, and that Japanese expansion could be contained. This psychological impact, difficult to quantify, was significant for American public opinion and military morale. For Japan, Coral Sea was the first strategic setback of the war. Every operation since Pearl Harbor had succeeded. Port Moresby's capture was considered essential for southern flank security. Its failure, while not catastrophic, indicated that American resistance was strengthening. Some Japanese officers recognized this as a warning sign, but institutional momentum and confidence in ultimate victory prevented strategic reconsideration. The push forward would continue, leading directly to Midway, where Japan's carrier striking force would be destroyed. The Battle of the Coral Sea marked a revolution in naval warfare. For the first time in history, carrier task forces engaged in battle without the opposing ships seeing each other. Surface guns played no role. The battle was decided by aircraft, by reconnaissance, by timing, and by the courage of pilots flying into hostile skies. Every carrier battle fought subsequently. Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, followed patterns established at Coral Sea. Tactically, Japan won. They sank more tonnage, inflicted more casualties, and could claim victory in traditional naval terms. Strategically, America won. Operation MO was cancelled. Port Moresby remained Allied. Japanese expansion was stopped for the first time. And critically, 2 Japanese carriers were removed from the Midway operation, shifting the balance in America's favor for that decisive battle. The battle demonstrated both the enormous potential and terrible vulnerability of aircraft carriers. These massive ships, capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles, were themselves fragile targets. A handful of bombs or torpedoes could sink them. This reality shaped naval doctrine throughout the Pacific War and into the modern era. For the men who fought at Coral Sea, American sailors aboard Lexington who abandoned ship in good order, Japanese sailors aboard Shoho who died when their carrier capsized, pilots on both sides who flew into overwhelming opposition. The battle was not about strategy or doctrine. It was about duty, courage, and survival. Many did not survive. Those who did carried memories of a battle that changed naval warfare forever. The waters of the Coral Sea, roughly 500 miles northeast of Australia, now hold the wrecks of ships from that May 1942 battle. Lexington rests on the sea floor, found by deep-sea exploration in 2018. Shoho lies somewhere in those same waters. Neosho drifted for days before sinking. These wrecks, and the men still aboard them, are monuments to a battle that established how naval wars would be fought in the aircraft age. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first carrier versus carrier battle. It would not be the last. Just 4 weeks later at Midway, American and Japanese carriers would meet again. But at Midway, 2 Japanese carriers would be missing, casualties not of combat but of the strategic consequences of Coral Sea. And at Midway, the balance would tip decisively, changing the Pacific War's trajectory forever. Coral Sea made Midway possible, and Midway made victory possible. The Coral Sea was where it began.